So, how do you play good in cards? Well, I'm about to tell you, so listen up. In my opinion, the core higher level concept is expected value. Now, expected value is a somewhat technical math term, but basically what it tells you is that for a situation with multiple outcomes, what's the average value, what's the average outcome given the weight and likelihood of each possible event? So basically, you take all the good events that could happen, you add them together, and you weight them by how likely they are to happen, multiply that by how good they are when it happens, and then from that you subtract all the bad events weighted by how bad they are and how likely they are to happen. So here's a simple example. We have two dice games. In game one, you get plus $4 if you roll even, minus 3 if you roll odd. So there's a 50% chance of you rolling even, which which is the good event, and the value of that good event is $4, plus $4 if you win. So 0.5 times 4, and then you subtract the bad event weighted by how likely that is to happen. You got a 50% chance of that happening. Again, rolling odd is 50%, and the value of that bad event is minus 3. So you get an expected value of 2 minus 1.5, so 0.5. What does that mean? That means on average, if you play this game, you're going to win $0.5 every time. Over the long run, you're going to win $0.5 every time you play this game. Game 2, if you have $2, get $2 every time you roll 4 or more. Otherwise, you get nothing. So same thing, 0.5 times 2 minus 0.5 times 0. So that's going to be 1. What does that actually, now what does all this mean? All of this just means that you want to play game 2 over the long run because it has a higher expected value. So you're going to get more out of playing game 2 over the long run because it has a higher expected value. So you always want to make the play with the greatest expected value. Now let's move on to an actual example. So let's take a look at a simple example here. We're playing US Frontline against Jagro. Now we're going to assume that the opponent is playing Jagro because if you're playing on ladder in FM, 99% of Jagro, 99% of Japan players will be Jagro at the moment. This can vary depending on the meta and what rank you're playing at, but we're going to simplify things and assume we're playing against Jagro. So take a second to think about what you would do here. Feel free to pause the video. All right, so let's analyze this situation. You have three possible plays. First is play 164th and move up. It's unlikely that they'll have no answer. It's likely that they'll have a blitz one drop to trade 1 for 1 because they're going second. They have quite a few cards, quite a few chances to find one blitz one drop, and it's quite unlikely that they have Out of the Mist. I have seen some Jagro players tech in Out of the Mist, but it's probably max 2 copies of in a deck, and they probably don't keep it versus US because a lot of US is gonna be ramp on ladder. At least that's what I've seen. So in the unlikely scenario that they have no answer, it's good. You got a 1-1 in the front line uncontested. In the likely scenario that they have a blitz one drop to answer it is going to be subpar because you're going 1 for 1 and you don't get the +1/+1 buff from the 164th, and you're going 1 for 1 when you're going first and you have fewer cards than your opponent. Generally, if you're going first, you want to look for 1-for-2 plays, if possible, because you have fewer cards to work with. And in the quite unlikely event that they have Out of the Mist, well, that's abysmal. Probably lost the game. So what's the overall expected value? Now notice here that there's no exact numerical values, and that's because it's pretty difficult and probably even impossible to assign an exact numerical value to the likelihood of each thing happening, and also to how good each or bad each thing is when it happens. So just estimate it based on your gut feeling. You have the most likely event, which is going to be the most strongly weighted event, is that they have a Blitz 1-drop to answer, and it's a little bit subpar, suboptimal, a little bad. You have an unlikely case where it's good, and a quite unlikely case where it's abysmal. So that about averages out the expected value to be about subpar, I would say. Now let's look at the second play. Play 164th, hold in the support line. Now it's likely that they'll have no direct answer. It's also likely that they'll still have a Blitz 1-drop, but notice that in this case, it won't directly trade out your 164th, if they do have it, unless they have Type 94 TK and they decide to trade. And then you still have the quite unlikely Out of the Mist scenario. So in this case, it's likely that it's going to be good, or at least, decent. It's also likely that it's going to be fine, and then you still have the quite unlikely, terrible, abysmal event. That averages out to be about good. And again, you kind of just eyeball it, because we're not going to play with exact numerical values and like bust out your calculator to calculate the stuff. Now it's mostly like based on feeling here. Now pass is kind of funny, because it's kind of like that bell curve meme where if you're a complete noob, you probably haven't even thought about passing. And again, nothing wrong with being a noob. We're not making fun of anyone here. This is just the meme format. If you're a noob, you probably haven't even thought of passing, because you're like, okay, well, we're playing a unit-based deck. Of course, we're gonna play units on curve. And then if you think a little bit more, maybe you're a little bit of a pseudo-intellectual. Well, you think, well, maybe I could pass, because that plays around Out of the Mist, and I can still play my PIR on turn 2, and I still have the option later on of using my 164th to trade out any opposing units, and I can more likely guarantee that it's going to get its +1/+1 buff off. And then, if you're a professional cards player like me, you'll realize that while it's guaranteed that they have no direct answer if you pass, it's still likely that they have a Blitz 1-drop, and now it's actually bad if they have a Blitz 1-drop. Notice in the first two scenarios when they had a Blitz 1-drop, first one it's subpar, second one it's fine if they have a Blitz 1-drop, but if you pass, it's bad if they have a Blitz 1-drop. Why is that? Because, well, first of all, they get a 1-drop in the front line, and then if you want to play PIR, then they get to hit you in the face for free with a Blitz 1-drop, and they also have the potential to pull off an early expansion while not being, you're giving them the tempo to play expansion because you didn't play anything on turn 1, so they have some time. They're not super behind on board. They can play an expansion for free, basically. And if you want on turn 2 to trade out their Blitz 1-drop with your 164th, now you're playing off curve really badly. Turn 1, you floated 1 credit. Turn 2, you also float a credit. Turn 3, potentially also bad, but you do have the Devil's Brigade. So you basically, You either allow them to hit you in the face for free and draw for free with expansion if you play the PIR, or you're playing heavily off curve if you trade with the 164th on turn 2. That's what happens if you pass. So that is going to be the analysis for this particular situation. All right, so now that you know what expected value is and how it applies to cards, let's start from the beginning of playing well, which is the deck building phase. So this is going to be an advanced level guide, so we're not going to cover the basics of deck building. I'm going to assume you know the basics of deck archetypes, how decks work, generally speaking, what aggro mid-range control are, and you have at least a general idea of how to build a functional deck. Right, so to briefly cover that, start with the core auto include cards, then work your way up to the optional slots. Test your deck with the different options in the optional slots, and then evaluate the EV of different options. So what does that look like? Let's give an example of the mid-range German slot in US Frontline. Now, personally, I started with 2 Panzergren in the deck because I saw most other people put that in their US Frontline list, at least in the past. And I found that the expected value here, it's subpar against aggro because it's just a bit too slow. It's good against mid-range, decent against control, and good against air. So not bad overall, but for me personally on ladder, I most likely encountered aggro and mid-range. I faced probably 80%, maybe 70 to 80% aggro or mid-range decks, and then a little bit less control and very rarely air. So that means that since I most likely faced aggro and mid-range, I'm going to weight the values of the aggro and mid-range events as more strongly. So that means that the overall expected value, I would say, is subpar because it's mediocre because it's not that great against aggro. It's good against mid range, and it's okay against control. Good against air, but I don't see control and air that much, so those are going to be weighted fairly small. Schützen, on the other hand, is good versus aggro. Yeah, obviously, some cards like Devil's Brigade are going to be better, but we're comparing we're doing relative comparisons. We're comparing Schützen to Panzergren, Schützen to other cards in the mid-range German slot of US Frontline, right? So we're doing relative comparisons, and relatively speaking, it's very good. Again, Schützen is very good against aggro. It's amazing versus mid-range. It's going to be mediocre versus control and pretty bad against air. However, as I mentioned, since I mostly face aggro and mid-range on ladder, that means that I'm going to weight those two very heavily. And since I would say Schützen is a lot better against aggro and mid-range, my expected value for Schützen is actually pretty good. Now again, another disclaimer, the probabilities here are pretty heavily dependent on your own experiences and the meta. So you guys will need to experiment and play a couple of games by yourself for the deck that you want to refine, and based on your own experiences and game knowledge, determine which of these cards are better. All right. All right. Let's move on to the Mulligan and the deck curve. On the right, you can see the US frontline list that I climbed to 3,000 ELO with last season, last month. And in the center, you can see the deck curve for that deck. Now, the curve you see is actually can be quite misleading. It doesn't necessarily show you the full picture. And if you want to think about it at a higher level, at a deeper level, you got to think about the full credit spend potential of each card and also consider whether or not a card is reactive and or proactive. So reactive means you play the card in reaction to a certain specific game state. And proactive means you can play the card at any time and it advances your own game win condition. So that's a lot of theory. Let's look at some actual examples. So for this deck, let's look at a one-drop example. For Greyhound or Scout card, they're slightly different, although they mostly fill the same slot and have the same properties. They can be considered as both proactive and reactive. So you could play Greyhound just on turn 1 to develop a unit, but you could also play it as a reaction. For example, you trade out a Jagro unit, a Jagro 1-drop on turn 2. And it can theoretically flex as a 1 to 3k cost card. And now why is that? Because it has Blitz and 1 op cost. That means you can play it for 1 credit and potentially operate it for 2 more credits. So technically, you could consider it as a potential 3-drop. Now, obviously, generally you don't want to play Greyhound and operate it twice early game. But we're just saying that the option is there. Now, if we look at 35T, it's conditionally proactive and reactive, and it has a static 2k cost, assuming you get the discount. I mean, 35T kind of sucks if you don't get the op cost discount, and that's why it's only conditionally proactive and reactive. You're generally not playing this on turn 2 unless you have an infantry to on turn 1. And the third example, half track, this is quite fully reactive. You often can't play this as a 3-drop on curve. It has a static 3k cost because it doesn't have blitz. And half track is like it's certainly more reactive than proactive. You almost like never want to just play half track without getting value from its deployment effect. It sucks if you just like drop it flat out without gaining any value from it. And then one more example, the Hellcat. It's also both proactive and reactive, and it can flex as a 3 to 5k unit. Generally, you don't want to play it on curve as on turn 3, but you could if you're in certain scenarios. You could if you're like reasonably certain it won't get removed and it fills out your curve pretty well. But it can also be played reactively to trade out a unit in the front line, to trade out a big enemy tank. And of course, you could play it proactively with 5 credits, push up Hellcat and hit the opponent in the face. So you get some damage in and also develop a unit into the front line. Now, what is the point of all this? Well, when you look at the deck curve, you have 12 cards that are 1 credit, but only 8 are reliable 1-drops on turn 1. A lot of them are going to be situational. Well, I mean, 4 of them are situational. And it gets worse for your 2-drops. You have 8 2-drops, but only one of them is guaranteed to be good on curve, and that's your PIR. And you have 11 3-drops, but 0 are guaranteed to be on curve. You could put Iron Man or Skytrain. I don't like Skytrain anymore, but you could certainly try out Iron Man. Just a quick side note, but it's kind of crazy when you think about it. 0 are guaranteed to be good on curve. Now, technically, you could kind of just flat out play an M10 in certain situations, but it's obviously not ideal. So when you consider all of this when building your deck and mulliganing, this is what you want to think about. Like if you have in your opening hand, let's say you have a 1-drop, you have like, say you have a Jaeger, and then you have a, I don't know, 22nd infantry, and you have a half track, you technically have a 1, 2, and 3 cost card. So you have a perfect curve, right? No, you don't. No, you don't. In fact, that's a pretty bad curve because it's unlikely that you're going to be able to play all your units on curve and get value from them. So that's what you need to be thinking about when you're mulliganing. It goes beyond just, oh, do I have a 1-drop for turn 1 and a 2-drop for turn 2, 3-drop for turn 3. You got to be thinking about what are the conditions for my 1-drop, 2-drop, and 3-drop to actually be good. Of course, by turn 3, you'll ideally have a couple of units on board that you can operate and fill out your curve a bit better. So that's actually the main reason why it's not terrible for you to not have any guaranteed 3-drops on turn 3. And you'll notice that historically speaking, US midrange has not had that many good on curve turn 3 plays. All right, if you made it this far, congratulations. Pat yourself on the back for having a longer than average attention span. Or maybe you skipped here. That's cool too. So it's finally time to watch some actual gameplay video and apply the concepts that we've learned. And we're doing this against none other than the 7th King of J himself. Crazy lineage, by the way. J King 7. We're playing against Old Blood KARDS royalty as a pleb. Let's see how this plays out. So, going first, US frontline against what is likely Jagro. You could maybe keep 35T. I personally didn't like it because, as I mentioned earlier, I want something that's more likely to go 1 for 2 if I go first. So I'm looking for like a 1-3, 1-drop over there. Sadly, I didn't get one. And we're gonna like speed up the boring parts because you've already passed your attention span test. We're not gonna make it that boring. Luckily, I top deck a scout car, so turn 2 turned out pretty well. And this part is going to be pretty straightforward. Not too much to talk about here. Now here's an interesting spot, and feel free to pause the video and think about what you would do here. Your opponent has 2 units in the front line. One is a 35T, which operates for free and is going to hit you in the face for free every turn that you don't deal with it. And you have a PIR that can value trade into both units, but your follow-up to that sucks. All you can do is play a 99th and not get any without getting any value from its deployment effect. And your play is going to be weak to bombing raid and desperate measures. And even if he doesn't have those, it's still not that great. On the other hand, you have Schützen, and Schützen will fill out your curve for now at the very least. The next turn after could still be pretty awkward, and is vulnerable to hard removal. So what do you do here? Well, let's see what I did here. So I thought the Schützen play was better, and I put it on the left to maximize HP on my units in case of a bombing raid. We're fine taking a little bit extra damage face here because we're still at 17 and winning the board is more important. Luckily, we get another good top deck. Get a Jaeger regiment. I'm starting to think I'm good at this top decking thing. Jaeger regiment allows us to trade out and take the front line and draw a card and get our 99th deployment effect. And here, not too much to say. Of course, you go for the Sherman. A little bit of a decision here. You could either go face, or you could just push up the PIR, or you could push up the 164th. I decided to go face to get some more damage in to set up a blitzkrieg and not commit more on the board in case of desperate measures. Shinano, and this is Fubar. Alright, so before I said we're gonna let your attention span relax, no more lecturing, well, I lied. We're gonna have to do some more thinking here, because this part of the game is the critical moment of the game. If you haven't before, pause the video when I told you to pause the video. Now's the time to do that, because you really need to think about this situation. Okay? Alright, I'll give you a moment to pause the video and think about what you would do in this spot by yourself before I talk about it. Alright, after looking at this board for a bit, you should realize that there's two main lines. One of them would be strat bombing, and the other would be blitzkrieg. Now, since blitzkrieg actually has the potential for lethal, often in many cases, let's calculate that line first. So if we push up the Sherman and then blitzkrieg, that's going to cost 5 credits. However, the Sherman's going to need to still operate for 1 credit after that, which means we can't additionally push up one of our small blitz tanks for our blitzkrieg. If we then look at double 35T and then blitzkrieg, that's going to fill out our credit curve perfectly at 7 credits, and it's going to deal 9 damage from the blitzkrieg plus 7 damage from the units themselves, totaling 16 damage, dropping our opponent down to 1. And that all but guarantees our lethal next turn with strat bombing. So once we find a guaranteed play like that, we're pretty safe to go for that. But during the actual turn, of course, I'm just calculating to make sure that I'm not actually missing lethal anywhere. Alright, let's pause this again, because now that this play is actually on board, do you guys notice something? Notice something that could potentially actually flip this game around entirely? Pause again if you want to think about it. Alright, so that something would be Desperate Measures, an insanely broken card. And if our opponent has desperate measures here, there's a decent chance we could lose the game. Now, why is that? Let's think about what would happen if he had desperate measures here. So both the 35Ts are gone. The Jaeger regiment is going to get traded out by the Panzergren. So the front line is going to be completely cleared, and my HQ drops down to 7. Now, if you're paying attention, you'll remember that he has a combined arms in hand. That's the revealed card that we have intel on. So that's a guaranteed 4/4 35T hitting me in the face for another 4, which drops me down to 3. So at this point, the alarm bells should be going off, and you should realize that we're actually in quite a lot of danger of losing the game if he has desperate measures. So after all that, he spent 3 credits. Sorry, he spent 2 with the desperate measures, 1 with the Panzergren, that's 3, and then 4th one on the CA. So he has 3 credits left over after that, and the board state is that he has a 4/4 35T in the front line, and I'm at 3. Now from that position, there's quite a few avenues, quite a few options for him to win the game from that. One of them would be deal one extra damage to my HQ, dropping me down to 2, and hold the front line sufficiently with at least 1 Shibata in the support line. That will mean that I cannot strap bombing for lethal, because the Shibata's effect triggers first and I'll just die. And he also needs to hold the front line sufficiently so that I don't just trade out his units in the front line and then go face with the scout car. And it is going to be a little tough for him to do that, because I do have the Sherman and also 164th to help retake the front line. But it's certainly possible. If we look at some of the ways he could achieve this, it'd be a combination of either Arado Type 93 or second Type 94 for the extra 1 damage. Remember that Arado will give the CA +1/+1 for that extra damage. So 1 credit to deal 1 extra damage, and then he has 2 credits to sufficiently hold the front line. He could do that by pushing up his Shibata and then playing another Shibata. He could do that with a Jaeger regiment. He could also commit the reserves on my Sherman, meaning that I don't have anything to trade out into the front line and attack his HQ with. There's a couple of ways. The second option would be to deal 2 damage, dropping me down to 1, and then playing Signal Regiment, meaning that I basically can't do anything. I can't trade out his units, and I can't play Strat Bombing because of the Shibata. So in this case, he can actually push up the Shibata, because if I want to trade out the Shibata to play Strat Bombing, I'm just going to die to the Signal. So to deal 2 extra damage, again, it's going to be like, it could be a combination of Arado Type 93, Type 94, the same options we discussed earlier. In this case, he has another option of 35T to deal 2 extra damage. And of course, with that 1 remaining credit, he's going to play Signal. The third option is to just straight up kill me outright. And that could be done again with this same combination of units that we talked about previously. Some combination of Arado Type 93, Type 94, 35T. Some combination of that. Remember, he has 3 credits left, so he has 3 credits to pick some combo of that and deal 3 damage directly to my face, ending the game. Now, by now you should realize that this is actually a situation where you can you can go really deep in calculating the different lines because this is starting to branch out. Remember that we started with two main lines, strat bombing, blitzkrieg, and then within the blitzkrieg line we had two sublines. One was pushing up Sherman, and then one was to blitz tanks with two, and we picked the 35T, the double 35T option from there. And then from that option, we're now calculating a scenario about how we could lose from desperate measures. And then there's three branches here of how we can lose from desperate measures, differentiated by how much damage he deals to my face. And we could keep going. For some of the different options, we could calculate like, okay, well maybe I can top deck Devil's Brigade for a lethal, or maybe for option one of dealing one damage to my face and then holding the front line sufficiently, I could maybe top deck another blitz unit to retake the front line and win. And we could calculate that, although at that point we're gonna get into really big diminishing returns. So reasonably, what can we reasonably do in an actual match like this? Because we're obviously not gonna like think this deep for like every in a regular ladder match, right? Well, we could recognize that our board would be pretty vulnerable to desperate measures, and because of the Shibata, my HQ HP total is actually not that safe after desperate measures, considering he has a Shibata and a 35T with CA in hand. So if we go back, let's go back for a moment. We could reconsider that play, and instead of double 35T, we could go for one scout car and one 35T instead for the blitzkrieg. We don't have to, if we've already done all the calculations so far, or rather just a double 35T blitzkrieg calculation of how much damage that's going to deal. We don't have to calculate that much extra. We know that it's just going to deal one less damage. So he's going to be at 2 here instead of 1. But we will have a 1-3 in the front line, which it makes our board significantly more resilient to desperate measures. Because even having a 1-1 in the front line, because of how narrow the margins are, remember when we were talking about how he can come back with desperate measures, most of those will involve him using like exact credit spend. Like there's very little margin for him to win, even if he does have desperate measures. So adding an extra 1-1 to the front line could certainly change things and block a lot of potential comeback lines with desperate measures. Of course, there's some other things to consider. Remember, I was talking about the Devil's Brigade. If, sorry, excuse me. If he's at 2 instead of 1, then Devil's Brigade won't be a direct lethal, although it might still just trade out his front line and let me go for the scout car face. Again, there's a ton you could calculate for this. And so that's just the blitzkrieg line. If we go back, we can still, if you want to, you can try to calculate the strat bombing line. I think strat bombing also puts me in a pretty good spot. It's going to be difficult for him to win after strat bombing. What do we do exactly? Probably strat bombing and then either attack face or maybe push up 164th to help hold the front line for a blitzkrieg next turn. Maybe something like that. This has already gotten really long, so I will not be calculating the details of the strat bombing line. Feel free to do so at your own leisure. Instead, let us just watch the conclusion of this game. And that's just me checking the combined arms. It may have been at this point that I was thinking about desperate measures. Thankfully, as soon as he makes that trade, I'm relieved because that very much likely means he does not have desperate measures, and now that's pretty much confirmed. And because of that, well, GG. For completion's sake, let us watch the end of this clip. And we see that he actually did have commit the reserves, which is which was one of the cards in one of the lines for a desperate measures comeback. But thankfully he didn't have it. And GG. So what did we learn from all that? Well, for one, it's not realistic to deeply analyze every single play, especially if you're playing on ladder and you're playing many games per day to try to climb. The second thing is that you get diminishing returns the deeper you analyze. For example, if we go back to that video, if we're calculating a super specific line, for example, how can J King kill me with 3 credits after I'm down to 3 HP from a desperate measures? That specific scenario probably won't happen. And analyzing that isn't going to affect my overall win rate that much. So, how do we approach the game overall then? If we note that we can't, realistically like spend a ton of time on analyzing every single play. Well, the first thing you want to do is approach plays by identifying the key cards and then derive the main lines you can take based on those key cards. So in that example, we noted that the 2 key cards and the 2 main lines were Blitzkrieg and Strat Bombing. Then we want to calculate those branches of the main lines to a depth roughly equivalent to how critical the situation is. So how critical a critical situation can look pretty different depending on what types of decks you're playing and what types of decks you're playing against. In that situation, if I find a line where I put my Jagro opponent down to 1 HP, then the game's guaranteed to end very quickly. Um, quite very, very, very likely to end it within the next turn, and if not the next turn, then the turn after that. Because Jagger has no healing, and I'm also low HP as well. I have no healing. Game's going to be over very soon. And in that sort of situation, then you want to put more effort into analyzing it because the game pretty much rests on that turn. Another example would be if you're playing a unit-based deck into a slower control deck, then you want to maybe give a little bit extra thoughts on the turns where they could have a board clear because let's say you full commit to a board and it gets completely wiped by carpet bombing or something like that, then the game's over for you pretty much. So that could also be a critical moment, and determining that will um, mostly come down to game knowledge and experience. The important thing is to just think about it as you're going along. When you win or lose a game, think about the what were the key moments in those games and what you could have done differently and what you did well. And yeah, that's going to be about it for a high level view on how to play well in cards. I probably won't make too many more of these types of videos, if any at all, in the future. Um, we're probably going to go back to making videos about fun decks. Um, if I do go back to making videos. And there's a new expansion coming up. I also have a fun deck that I've built and been playing recently. Might do a video on that. If you've watched this video to the end, thanks a ton. I really appreciate you, my dear viewer, for watching this video in its entirety because I did take a decent amount of effort to come up with all this. And yeah, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you in the next video.